Now, the stimulus that he has is in part from Charles Lyell, the geologist, who had discovered deep time. And that convinced Darwin that there would have been enough time. He stops in Argentina. In the banks of a river in Argentina, he can see giant fossil armadillos, and then right on the top of that same bank, he can see the current armadillos walking around up on top of the bank. There they are. The live ones are right above the fossil ones. They look the same, but, they look similar, but they're not the same. So there's some connection there. He gets on a horse in Chile, and he rides up into the Andes, and he sees marine fossils lifted thousands of feet above sea level. Clearly, some dynamic processes going on that had lifted those marine fossils up. He doesn't know about continental drift yet, right? But there the fossils are. In the harbor at Valparaiso, he sees the effects of an earthquake that had happened just before they arrived. It was a big one. It was probably as large as the earthquake that recently caused the big tsunami in Indonesia, so it was probably an 8.6 earthquake. And it had caused an uplift in the harbor of maybe 50 feet. So he began to see the world as dynamic. Things hadn't always been the way they are. Then he goes to the Galapagos. And please navigate the Galapagos website and have a look at some of these differences. The thing that Darwin noticed is that the mockingbirds are different on the different islands. If you go to the Galapagos, what you'll notice is that if you land on Hispaniola, the mockingbirds really want your water supply, and they will hop onto your head or your knee to try to get at your water supply. But in fact, the mockingbirds all look a little bit different on the different islands, and that's what Darwin noticed. He could also see that the marine iguanas look a bit different, and the land iguanas look different. Interestingly, he didn't notice the differences in the finches until he got back to England and gave his collection to the British Museum, and the ornithologist at the British Museum came in and said, "Hey, Darwin, do you realize that the finches on these islands are different?" And that was when he began to really see how many differences could accumulate, how rapidly, when you take a migrant from Central America and put it on an isolated archipelago. So he goes back to London. He's been on board ship for about 4 years. He has a problem with seasickness. He never again sets foot on a ship. He doesn't want to go near the water after being 4 years on this ship. He had a few issues with the captain too, Fitzroy, but mainly it was that he had a very bad upset stomach on board the Beagle. He reads the Reverend Malthus on population growth. Malthus's book had come out in 1798. Malthus said basically that populations grow exponentially, but agriculture grows linearly. Therefore, populations will always outstrip their resource base. This convinced Darwin that all organisms are in a competitive struggle for resources and that must inevitably be the case. He saw very clearly how powerful reproduction is at generating exponential population growth. We will come back to that in the ecology portion of the course. And we now know that organisms are in competition really essentially not just over food resources, they are in competition over anything that will get their genes into the next generation. So that can be competition for mates, it can be competition for nesting sites, competition for food, lots of different things. But at any rate, this primed Darwin's thinking. So he writes down the idea of natural selection. It comes to him in 1838. It's in his notebooks in 1838. Basically, I'll run through natural selection in a minute. It's a deceptively simple idea because the mechanism looks so simple, but the consequences are so wide-ranging. Darwin recognized what the consequences were, and he didn't publish immediately. He did other things. He went off and he worked 5 or 6 years on barnacles. He wrote down lots of ideas about things unrelated to natural selection. And he wasn't really jogged out of this until a letter arrived in 1858 from Alfred Russel Wallace, a young British naturalist who had, in a fit of malarial fever had the same idea in Indonesia. And Wallace knew that Darwin had been thinking about these things, and he sent Darwin a letter. And at that point, Darwin, British gentleman as he was, had to decide whether he would do the sort of gracious, honorable thing and let Wallace have the idea, or do the honest thing, which his colleagues knew was that he had already had the idea. And what they decide upon is that they will do a joint publication. So if you go to the Biological Journal of the Linnaean Society for 1858, which is in the Yale Library, you can look up the back-to-back papers by Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin in which the idea of natural selection is laid out. And then Darwin rushes his book into print. So he has been working on a book that was probably going to be about 1,200 pages long, and instead he publishes an abstract of it, which he calls The Origin of Species, which is about 350 pages long. And it sells out on the first day, sold all 6,000 copies on the first day, and it has remained in print ever since. That's the Beagle. Darwin slept in a hammock in the captain's cabin at the back of the ship, which rocked horribly. And that's essentially all I want to do about the development of the idea of evolution. Basically what I did was I wanted to give you the feeling that there was somebody like you who went out and knew what a deep problem was and happened to have the luck to get into a special situation where they were stimulated and came up with an idea that changed the world. No reason it can't happen again. So now I'm going to give you a brief overview of microevolution and macroevolution. Here's natural selection. Here's Darwin's idea. If in a population there is variation in reproductive success, what does that mean? Would everybody in the room raise their hand if they're an only child? Look around. There are about 5 or 6. How many of you come from families with 2 children? Lots. How many with 3? Quite a few. How many with 4? Quite a few, but not about as many as there were with only children. Anybody with 5? Yep, a couple. Anybody with 6? No. If we were, by the way, in the 19th century, at this point, there would still be lots of hands going up. What you've just seen is the amount of variation in reproductive success represented by the families in this room. Variation in reproductive success basically means that different families have different numbers of offspring, or different individuals have different numbers of offspring. Then there has to be some variation in a trait. How many of you are under 5 feet 5? Raise your hands. How many between 5'5" and 6 feet? How many over 6 feet? Lots of variation in height in this room. So we got lots of variation in reproductive success, lots of variation in height. Has to be a non-zero correlation between reproductive success and the trait. On this particular trait, there's been some research. Turns out that taller men have more children. I don't know whether that's just an NBA effect or what that is, but it turns out to be true in many societies. So there is a non-zero correlation between the reproductive success and the trait. Then there has to be heritability for the trait. The heritability of height in humans is about 80%. So, all of the conditions for natural selection on height are present in this room.